The gavel came down so hard that the water glasses on the council table jumped, and every man in that room turned to look at Garrett Olin as though he had lost his very mind. "You are out of order, Olin," said Mayor Harlan Fitch, his thick mustache quivering with barely contained fury. "Sit down before I have you removed from this chamber." Garrett did not sit down. He stood at the back of that low-ceilinged room in the Colton Creek Town Hall, his hat pressed against his chest, his jaw set like a man who had already decided what kind of person he intended to be before he walked through that door. Around him, ranchers and merchants shifted in their chairs. Some would not look at him. Others stared with open hostility. Outside, through the one streaky window, the October wind was pushing tumbleweeds down Main Street in the blue early dark. "I am not out of order," Garrett said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet that was louder than shouting. "What's out of order is this council deliberating on the good name of a woman who is not present to speak for herself. What's out of order is calling it a vote when it's nothing but a sentencing." Harlan Fitch's face had gone the color of raw beef. "The matter before this council is the loan extended to Miss Alara Lindell, and the question of whether she obtained it through fraudulent misrepresentation of her assets. That is a legal and financial matter, Olin, not a question of anyone's character." "You just said her name in the same breath as the word fraud," Garrett replied. "Where I come from, that is very much a question of character." He could feel the stares. He could feel the weight of every alliance he had built over 8 careful years in this territory, every handshake agreement, every seat at this very table he had earned by being the kind of man who never made scenes and never caused trouble. He could feel all of it tipping on a knife's edge. "Furthermore," said Council Member Douglas Pratt, a reedy man with small eyes and a great deal of borrowed authority, "I would remind you that your own seat at this table was granted under the condition that you contribute to the responsible governance of this community, not obstruct it when it inconveniences your personal interests." The room went very quiet. Garrett looked at Douglas Pratt for a long moment. Then he looked at the mayor. Then he looked at every man seated at that long table, reading their faces, and what he read there settled something in him the way a stone settles to the bottom of still water. He placed his hat carefully on the empty chair beside him. He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and withdrew a folded envelope. He set it on the table with a sound that was barely audible, and yet everyone heard it. "My resignation," he said, "effective immediately. Now I am a private citizen with no conflict of interest, and I intend to speak." That was the moment everything changed. But to understand why a man like Garrett Olin would walk away from the most powerful seat in Colton Creek County, over a woman he had barely spoken 20 full sentences to, you would have to go back 6 weeks. You would have to go back to a Tuesday morning in September when a wagon broke down in front of his east pasture gate, and a woman stood beside it with her sleeves rolled up and her hands on her hips, looking at a cracked axle with the concentrated expression of someone calculating exactly how much trouble they were in. Garrett had been riding his fence line. He did it every Tuesday and Thursday after the morning muster of his hands, because he had learned early in his time on the Colton Creek Range that a man who did not know the edges of his own property would eventually lose the center of it. He ran 1,200 head of longhorn cattle on a spread that stretched from the dark line of the Cottonwood Creek on the south end to the rocky shelf of Antler Ridge on the north, and every inch of it had cost him something. He had come to Colton Creek in 1878 with $300, 2 horses, and a stubbornness that his mother had once told him would either make him great or kill him. By the autumn of 1884 he was 31 years old, and the jury was still out on which it would be. He had land and cattle and a seat at the town council, and a house that was bigger than he needed, and a silence inside him that grew louder every winter. He was not an unhappy man. He simply was not a complete one. He saw the wagon from 100 yards out and altered his course without thinking much about it. A broken-down wagon on a ranch road was a common enough problem, and one that he had learned to stop for, because out here, you helped people with broken wagons the same way you helped people caught in storms, because there was no one else to do it and someday it would be you. He did not expect the woman. She was perhaps 27, he guessed, though he would later learn she was 25. She had dark brown hair that was escaping from a practical bun at the back of her neck and falling in pieces around her face, which was a face of the kind that stopped you for a second before you could properly organize your thoughts. Not beautiful in any delicate or conventional arrangement, but arresting in the way that good landscape is arresting, the way that a well-proportioned valley is arresting, because every element of it was in honest proportion to every other element, and the whole of it was entirely itself, without apology. She was kneeling in the road dust beside the rear wheel of a loaded farm wagon, and she had a piece of the broken axle housing in her hand, and she was examining it with the serious, focused attention of someone who had dealt with broken things before, and intended to deal with this one too. He pulled up at the gate and dismounted. "Can I help you?" She looked up. Her eyes were a particular shade of gray-green that he did not have a word for, but which registered on him with a clarity that was slightly startling. "I think the axle box cracked," she said, not as a complaint but as a factual assessment. "I heard it going about half a mile back, but I thought I could make it to the Dunmore place before it gave out entirely." "You're going to the Dunmore place?" "I bought the Dunmore place," she said. "Or the bank and I bought it jointly, if you want to be precise about it." He processed that. The Dunmore place was a 160-acre homestead about 3 miles further along the road, a solidly built little operation that old Pete Dunmore had worked alone until his health went the previous spring, and his daughter in St. Louis had insisted he come east to live with her. It had a good well, a sound house, and a small herd of mixed cattle that had been sold off at auction. The land itself was good pasture. He had thought about buying it himself and decided against it because he was already managing more than was comfortable for a man running a lean outfit. "Elara Lindell," the woman said, and stood up and extended her hand in the direct way of someone who had decided early in life that certain social hesitations were a waste of everyone's time. "Garrett Olin," he said, and shook it. Her hand was strong and her grip was even, and she looked at him when she shook his hand, which he noted because some people did not. "I have heard of you," she said. "You run the Olin cattle operation. 1,200 head, give or take. You sit on the town council. People seem to think you are either very fair or very stubborn depending on who you ask." He found himself unexpectedly close to something that was not quite a smile. Those are not necessarily mutually exclusive. "No," she agreed. "They are not." She looked back at the axle. "I don't suppose you have a spare axle box on you." "I don't. But I have 2 strong ranch hands and a supply wagon back at my place. We could pull this one off the road and get your load moved to the Dunmore property before nightfall if you're willing to accept the help." She considered this, and he could see her considering it, weighing the inconvenience of accepting help against the practical reality of her situation. "I would appreciate that," she said finally, and there was no embarrassment in it. Only the practical honesty of someone who knew what was needed. That was September. For 3 weeks after that, he told himself he was simply being a good neighbor. He rode over twice to check that she had settled in without difficulty. He sent one of his men to help her patch a section of fence that had been deteriorating since Pete Dunmore's health had started to go. He sent word through the post office that if she needed the name of a reliable blacksmith, there was a man named Cobb 2 towns over who did honest work at honest prices. These were the things that neighbors did. He was certain of it. He was less certain about why he found himself thinking about the way she had stood in the road with that broken axle piece in her hand, looking at it with that considering expression, like the problem was already halfway solved if she could just see it clearly enough. He learned more about her in pieces, the way you learn about people in small communities where information travels on its own schedule. She had come from Nebraska, from a farm family that had done decently for a time and then done poorly and then done badly. And she had spent her adult years teaching school in a town called Granger while she saved what she could and waited for the right land to become available at a price she could reach. She had a modest inheritance from an aunt that had provided part of her capital, and she had obtained a loan from the Colton Creek Cattleman's Bank for the balance of the Dunmore purchase price. She had no family in the territory. She had come alone and intended to build alone, which was the kind of statement that made men in Colton Creek look at her with a mixture of skepticism and something that was not quite admiration, but was adjacent to it. She was not popular with everyone. Garrett noticed this in the careful way that a man with a seat on the town council had learned to notice things, which was obliquely and without comment, cataloging information the way you catalog weather signs. There was Douglas Pratt, who had made a bid on the Dunmore land himself and lost it to Alara's offer by a matter of days, and who had since developed a cold, formal dislike of her that he dressed up in the language of concern for proper land stewardship. There was Harlan Fitch's wife, Clara, who said she had nothing against the woman personally, but found it peculiar that a woman alone would take on that kind of enterprise without a husband to guide her, a comment that was meant charitably and landed like a stone. And there was a man named Roy Sutter, who ran a modest cattle operation on the far side of the county, and who had apparently asked to call on Alara twice in October and been politely but unambiguously declined both times, after which he had stopped being polite about her at all. Garrett heard Roy Sutter's name, in connection with Alara's, for the first time at a cattle trade meeting in the second week of October, when two of the older ranchers were talking in the low, careful way that people talk when they are not quite saying what they mean. He heard the words "that Lindell woman," and "something not quite right," and Sutter says, and then the conversation shifted as he approached, the way conversations in small places will shift when someone with authority walks into them. He noted it the way he noted everything. He did not act on it yet. The next time he saw Alara was a Thursday, his fence line riding day, and she was on the south boundary of her property looking at a stand of her cattle with that concentrated analytical expression that he was beginning to recognize as her default mode of engagement with the world. She had 8 animals, a mix of Hereford and Longhorn crosses, and they were in reasonable condition, but not what she had hoped. She told him this directly when he pulled up at the fence line, and she walked over, because she had quickly established a pattern of speaking to him the way she spoke to no one else in Colton Creek, which was honestly, "I need at least 20 head to make the operation viable in the short term," she said. "I've been writing to cattle brokers, but the prices I'm seeing make the numbers difficult. What are your numbers looking like?" He asked, and was surprised to find that the question felt natural, the way questions between people who trust each other feel natural. She told him. She was precise and unembarrassed, and she had clearly been running the calculations for some time. He listened and asked questions, and made 2 suggestions, one about a broker he knew in Abilene who might deal fairly, and one about a grazing arrangement that might reduce her winter feed costs. She listened with the same focused attention she gave everything, and said she would think about both, which he had come to understand was her way of saying that she took his input seriously but reserved judgment for herself, which he respected. He rode home that afternoon feeling something that he had not felt in a long time, which was the specific and slightly dangerous pleasure of looking forward to the next conversation. He called on her formally the following Saturday. He brought a jar of his housekeeper, Mrs. Calloway's apple preserves, which was the accepted currency of neighborly calling in Colton Creek County, and he sat in Alara's modest front room, which she was slowly making her own with clean curtains and a braided rug and a bookshelf that was the most impressive thing in the house, and they talked for 2 hours. They talked about cattle and about the winter prospects, and about the Colton Creek Council's ongoing debate about the water rights along the creek. And then they stopped talking about practical things and talked about books, because she had Dickens and George Eliot, and a battered copy of Thoreau that she said she had read so many times she had her own arguments with it in the margins, and he had not talked about books with anyone in 4 years. He walked home in the dark with the particular brightness that good conversation leaves behind in a person, the sense that the world is more interesting than it was this morning, and he stood on his porch for a while looking at the stars over the ridge and decided that he was in considerable trouble. He was not wrong. The trouble arrived in earnest on the 22nd of October, which was a Wednesday, when Douglas Pratt filed a formal complaint with the Colton Creek Cattlemen's Bank, alleging that Alara Lindell had misrepresented the value of her property assets in her loan application, specifically claiming that her Nebraska farm inheritance was unencumbered, when it had in fact carried a partial lien. The allegation, if proven, could result in her loan being called in full immediately. With what little capital she had left after the purchase and the improvements she had already made, calling the loan would mean losing the land. Garrett learned about this from his banker, Thomas Arce, who stopped him outside the general store on a Wednesday afternoon with the careful manner of a man delivering news that is both confidential and too significant to keep entirely to himself. "The complaint has been filed," Thomas said quietly. "Pratt's name is on it, but I'd be surprised if the original idea came from him. He doesn't have the legal vocabulary in the filing. Someone helped him write it." "Roy Sutter," Garrett said. Thomas did not confirm or deny this. He looked at the middle distance and said, "The council will hear the matter next Monday. As a sitting council member, your vote would count. I thought you should know." Garrett spent that Thursday and Friday thinking about what he knew and what it meant. He had seen Alara's loan documents, not because he had any right to, but because Thomas Arce had shown him the complaint letter, and in the letter was a summary of the bank's file. The Nebraska inheritance had carried a lien. That part was true, but the lien had been discharged 14 months before Alara had made her loan application, and the discharge paperwork existed and was recorded in the Dawson County, Nebraska, clerk's office. The claim that she had misrepresented her assets was, in the precise legal language, demonstrably false. But here was the thing about a council hearing in 1884 in a place like Colton Creek. Truth was sometimes insufficient defense against a well-organized accusation, particularly when the person being accused was an outsider and a woman, and particularly when 2 of the 7 council members had personal reasons to want to see her fail. He rode to her property on Saturday morning. He had to tell her what was coming. She was in the small barn when he arrived, doing the measured, methodical work of morning feeding with the self-contained competence that was by now entirely familiar to him. She heard his horse and came to the barn door and looked at him, and whatever she saw in his face made her own face go still. "Tell me," she said simply. He told her everything. He watched her take it in. saw the moment it landed, saw her shoulders go back and her jaw set in the way he had come to recognize as her response to things that were very difficult, which was to stand more perfectly straight and look at them more perfectly directly. "Can they call the loan on a false claim?" she asked when he was done. "They can try. The council hearing on Monday will determine whether the bank is asked to investigate further. If the council votes to proceed with a formal inquiry, the bank can place a hold on the property while the investigation runs. And if there's a hold, I can't make improvements, can't take on additional cattle, can't do anything that requires credit." "That's right." She was quiet for a moment. "Who is driving this?" Pratt filed it. "I think Sutter is behind it." She absorbed this with the particular controlled stillness of a person who is very angry and has decided to be precise about it rather than loud. "Because I would not receive him. That would be my reading." She looked past him at the October pasture, at her 8 cattle grazing in the pale morning light. "What can I do?" "Get the discharge paperwork from Nebraska. Telegraph the Dawson County clerk immediately. If you can have the documentation in hand before Monday, you can present it at the hearing." "And if I can't get it in time," he had thought about this. He had thought about it for 2 days. "Then I'll speak for you at the council. I have a vote and I'll use it." She looked at him then with an expression he could not fully read because it was complicated. It was gratitude and something that was not quite comfort, but was close to it. And underneath both of those things was something careful and guarded that he recognized as the expression of a person who had learned not to depend on help that might not materialize. "I don't want you to put yourself at odds with the council on my account," she said. "You have built something here. I would not want to damage it." "That's my decision to make," he said. And then, because it felt important to say, and because he was not a man who generally said things unless he meant them, he said, "I don't think a man's council seat is worth much if he holds it by staying quiet when he knows what's right." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Garrett," and it was the first time she had used his first name, and the weight of it was something he felt in his chest. She spent Saturday afternoon and Sunday morning at the telegraph office in Colton Creek, sending urgent requests to the Dawson County Clerk's office in Nebraska for certified copies of the lien discharge documentation. The telegraph operator, a young man named Simon Hale who was scrupulously honest in a profession that required it, confirmed receipt of the messages and told her he would watch for any response personally. The response did not come by Sunday night. It did not come by Monday morning either. Garrett arrived at the town hall that Monday evening with the specific, settled dread of a man who knows he is about to do something costly and has decided to do it anyway. He took his usual seat at the council table and kept his own counsel while Harlan Fitch opened the meeting, and Douglas Pratt presented his complaint with the careful precision of a man who had rehearsed it, reading from a prepared document in a voice that was pitched for official gravity and landed about 3 notes short of it. Garrett listened. He listened to every word and cataloged every deliberate imprecision, every phrase that was technically accurate but contextually misleading, every moment where Pratt said, "appears to have misrepresented," rather than misrepresented, because that careful vagueness was doing a great deal of work. He noted that Roy Sutter was sitting in the gallery with his hat on his knee and a look of studied indifference that was not indifference at all. When Pratt finished and Fitch asked if any council member had comments before the vote on whether to proceed with inquiry, Garrett stood up. He said what he said. He laid it out clearly and without theater. He explained the lien discharge. He explained the timeline. He explained that what Pratt's complaint called misrepresentation was in plain fact a clerical ambiguity in the loan application that any competent banker reviewing the underlying records would immediately resolve in the applicant's favor. He said that the council was being asked to vote to proceed with an inquiry into a matter that was not only demonstrably resolved by existing public record, but that had been raised, to his informed belief, for reasons having nothing to do with the legitimate administration of credit or the protection of the bank's interests. Fitch told him he was out of order. Pratt told him his personal interests were creating a conflict. And Garrett reached into his pocket and withdrew the resignation letter that he had spent Sunday night writing and rewriting, until it said exactly what he meant and nothing it didn't. And he put it on the table, and the room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something irreversible has just happened. "My resignation," he said, "effective immediately. Now I am a private citizen with no conflict of interest, and I intend to speak." He spoke for 11 minutes. He was later told by Simon Hale, who was in the gallery taking notes in the shorthand he had taught himself because he had ambitions beyond the telegraph desk, that it was the most quietly devastating 11 minutes of public speaking Colton Creek had witnessed since a circuit judge had dismantled a fraudulent land claim from the bench 3 years prior. Garrett did not shout. He did not accuse. He laid out what was known, what was documented, what was the plain, reasonable inference from the sequence of events, and he left every man in that room to do his own arithmetic. The council voted 4-2 to table the inquiry pending review of the underlying loan documentation by an independent assessor. It was not a vindication, not yet, but it was a pause, and a pause was enough. Outside the town hall afterward, in the cold dark of an October night with the wind coming down from the ridge and the lamplight from the saloon throwing long orange shapes across the street, Garrett found Alara standing at the edge of the wooden sidewalk. She had been in the gallery. He had not known she was there. She looked at him, and he could see that she had been crying, not currently but recently, the particular clarity that tears leave in a person's eyes. "You gave up your seat," she said. "I did. Garrett." She said his name with a weight in it that was difficult to describe except to say that it was the weight of someone who understood what something cost and was refusing to diminish that cost by pretending it was small. "It needed saying," he said. "You built 8 years on that council seat." "I built 8 years on being a man I could look at in the morning," he said. The seat was a secondary benefit. She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved her hair, and she put a hand up to hold it back and looked at him with that gray-green directness. "Thank you does not feel like adequate currency for what you just did." "I didn't do it to be paid," he said. Something in her face shifted. It was subtle and it was significant. "Why did you do it then?" He considered this question honestly, the way he tried to consider all things. "Because it was right," he said, "and because it was you." She looked at him for a long time in the lamplight and the cold wind. Then she said, "Walk me home." They walked 3 miles in the dark to the Dunmore place, which was her place now, and they talked the whole way, and what they talked about was not the council or the loan or Douglas Pratt or Roy Sutter. They talked about Nebraska, and about the particular quality of winter stars in a place where there are no trees close enough to interrupt the horizon, and about the specific terror and freedom of building something from nothing, and about what it meant to want something so much that the wanting itself was exhausting. They talked until they reached her gate and stood there in the dark with the cattle moving quietly in the near pasture and the house dark ahead of her. "Come for supper Thursday," she said. "Yes," he said, without any hesitation at all. He walked home alone in the dark with the stars overhead and the wind at his back, and felt something that was either the beginning of something very good or the beginning of something very complicated. In his experience, those were usually the same thing. The certified documentation from the Dawson County Clerk's office arrived by telegraph on Wednesday morning, 2 days after the council hearing. Simon Hale brought the transcript to Alara personally, walking it the 3 miles from the telegraph office himself, because he understood the weight of it. The discharge of the Nebraska lien was there in black and white, dated 14 months before the loan application, signed and officially recorded. She brought it to Thomas Arce at the bank that afternoon. Thomas read it with the careful expression of a man who is relieved and slightly embarrassed in equal measure. The embarrassment belonging to an institution that had allowed a legitimate customer to be publicly impugned without adequate investigation. He said that in light of the documentation, the bank found no basis for the inquiry, and that the complaint filed by Douglas Pratt was being formally closed without action. She thanked him with precise and particular courtesy and walked out of the bank into the October afternoon and stood on the sidewalk for a moment breathing the cold air. It was over in the formal sense. Her land was safe. Her loan was secure. Her name, in the bank's records at least, was clear. But names travel in communities, and a complaint filed is not undone simply by being withdrawn, and she knew this. She knew that there would be people in Colton Creek who heard the complaint and did not hear the resolution, who knew she had been accused and did not know she had been vindicated, and that this was simply the nature of the place she had come to live and the time she had come to live in it. She thought about this while she walked home, and what she felt was not despair but something close to the particular weariness that comes from knowing that being right is not always sufficient, and that being a woman alone in a place like this meant that insufficient was sometimes all you were going to get. Then she thought about Garrett Olin standing up in that council room and putting his resignation letter on the table, and what she felt then was more complicated and warmer and somewhat terrifying in the specific way that feeling warmly about another person is always terrifying when you have been alone long enough to have become comfortable with the silence. Thursday came and she cooked a proper supper, roast chicken and potatoes from her root cellar and bread that she had baked herself, which she was good at because her mother had been good at it, and she had paid attention. She set the table with what she had, which was not much, 2 mismatched plates and plain flatware and a single candle in a simple holder, and it looked honest and nothing like enough and exactly right. He arrived at the hour he had said he would arrive, because he was the kind of man who did, and he came in out of the cold with his hat in his hand and looked at the table and the candle and said, "That smells wonderful," and she knew he meant it. They ate and they talked. He asked about the documentation from Nebraska, and she told him it was resolved, and she watched relief move across his face like weather, clean and uncomplicated, the relief of a man who had staked something on her behalf and was glad to know the stake had held. She felt something tighten in her chest watching it. After supper, they sat by the small stove with cups of coffee, and she said, because she had decided on honesty a long time ago and saw no reason to abandon it now, "Can I ask you something direct?" "You can always ask me something direct," he said. "Why did you come to tell me about the complaint? Before the hearing, you could have simply voted in my favor and never said a word to me about it." He looked at his coffee cup for a moment. "Because you had a right to know what was being done to your name before it was done, and because I thought you might be able to gather the documentation in time to stop it from going as far as it did." "That's the practical answer," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said quietly, "it is." She waited. "The other answer," he said, "is that by the time I knew what Pratt was doing, I found that I had a considerable personal stake in what happened to you, and I wasn't comfortable sitting on it." The candle moved in a draft from under the door. "I am not easy to know," she said, because she felt he should understand this. I have been alone for a long time, and I have organized my life around independence, and I am not always graceful about accepting that other people might have a legitimate place in it. I have also been alone for a long time, he said, and I am not always graceful about admitting that I want something, because for a long time the wanting seemed like it wouldn't go anywhere useful, and I became accustomed to not wanting. And now, she said. He looked at her with the direct and patient honesty that was his most essential quality. Now I think it might go somewhere quite useful indeed, if you're willing. She looked at him across the little table with the candle between them and the stove ticking against the cold and the cattle quiet outside in the dark, and she said, "I think I am." It was not a grand declaration. It was not the language of dime novels or the overheated sentiment of letters written by people who had never met. It was what it was, two people who knew how to look at things clearly and were choosing carefully and deliberately to look at each other. He did not stay late. He rode home in the deep dark with a different quality of silence inside him than usual, a silence that had something in it now, something that had not been there this morning. What followed was a courtship, which is a word that sounds stately and measured and does not quite capture what it was, which was two people in the middle of a working life discovering that the other person made the working life more interesting in ways that were increasingly difficult to separate from the other kind of interesting. He rode over on Saturdays. She came to his place twice to look at his breeding records, which she had asked about after he mentioned a particular line of Hereford crosses that had proven consistently hardy on the cold Colton Creek range. And the conversation about cattle genetics had gone on for 3 hours and ended with his housekeeper, Mrs. Calloway, appearing in the parlor doorway with a highly expressive look on her face and 2 cups of coffee. Mrs. Calloway, who was a sensible woman in her 50s with a gift for observing things and a policy of not commenting on them unless asked, was not asked. But she kept the coffee coming. He asked Alara to ride the northern range with him one Saturday in November, the day after the first heavy frost, when the grass was silver at the tips, and the air had that particular cold clarity that makes a landscape look like it has been outlined in ink. They rode for 2 hours, and she sat a horse well, which he had expected but was glad to confirm. And they looked at the cattle moving on the winter pasture and talked about the spring market, and about a report he had read in the Stockman's Journal about new disease management practices that were showing promising results in Texas operations. At the top of a long rise from which you could see the full sweep of the valley on a clear day, they stopped. She looked out at it, the creek line dark among the bare cottonwoods, the ridge to the north still catching light, the town barely visible as a cluster of shapes in the middle distance, and she said, "This is beautiful." "Yes," he said, and he was looking at her. She turned and looked at him, and there was a moment between them that was very full and very still, the kind of moment that happens sometimes in open country where there is nothing to interrupt it. Then she said, very quietly, "Garrett." "Yes," he said again, because there was nothing else to say. He reached across the space between their horses and took her gloved hand and held it. She looked at their hands for a moment and then looked up at him, and the expression on her face was the one he would remember for the rest of his life, an expression that was entirely itself, no pretending and no armor, just her looking at him with something open and true in her gray-green eyes. They stayed up there on the rise for a while and then rode back down together, and the quality of the space between them had changed. Douglas Pratt avoided Garrett for 2 weeks after the council meeting. Roy Sutter was reported to have said things about both of them at the saloon, things that the particular code of the place meant he would have to say to their faces if he intended them seriously. He did not say them to their faces. He took his business south to the Benton County markets in November and was seen less frequently in Colton Creek through the winter. Garrett was replaced on the council by a man named Frederick Morin, a dry goods merchant who was honest and dull in equal measure and who would do no harm. The council continued its business. The water rights debate dragged on. Life in Colton Creek carried on with the general indifference of small communities to the individual dramas occurring within them. This generated comment, as everything in a small place generates comment. Some of the comment was warm, because Garrett was liked by most people and there were women in the community who had watched Alara with sympathy since the business of the complaint and who were glad to see things resolving. Some of it was less warm, carrying the particular flavor of communities that are uncertain about change. Mrs. Calloway, when Garrett mentioned at breakfast one morning in a carefully casual tone that Miss Lindell had agreed to come for dinner the following Sunday, said simply, "I will make the good roast." And that was all she said, but the manner in which she said it contained a great deal of information. That Sunday dinner was the first time Alara and Mrs. Calloway properly met, and within 20 minutes they were in the kitchen together discussing bread-making techniques, with the absorbed mutual engagement of two people who have found someone else who takes bread seriously. And Garrett sat in his parlor listening to them talk, and felt something very domestic and very good spreading through the house like warmth from a fire that had been cold for a long time. In December, 6 weeks after the council meeting, he asked her to take a walk with him after the Sunday service. It was cold and the sky was white and the street was quiet and the snow on the ground was new and clean. They walked to the end of the main street and back, and he said, because he was not a man for elaborate construction when the plain thing would serve, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever you answer, it won't change anything between us." She looked at him. "All right." "I would like to court you properly," he said. "With your clear understanding and agreement, I would like to call on you with the specific intention of knowing you well enough, and well enough in return, to consider a future. And I would like to do that openly, so that there is no ambiguity about my intentions or yours." She was quiet for a moment. They walked. "Garrett," she said, "I have been watching you since September, and what I have seen is a man who told the truth when it was costly, who kept his word when it was easier not to, who treated me like an equal in every practical conversation, and never made me feel that my independence was a problem he was trying to solve. Those things matter to me. They matter more than most people understand." "They should matter," he said. "Yes," she said. "And so my answer is yes. I would very much like that." Winter came down over Colton Creek with its full weight, and they went through it together. Not together in the sense of shared roof or shared table every night. They were careful about the forms that the community observed, not out of deception, but out of a mutual understanding that the life they were building had to be built on solid ground. And solid ground in their time and place required the respect of the community they lived in. But together in the sense that matters more, which is the sense of each person knowing the other is there. He taught her things about the cattle operation that she had been too proud to ask for help with before. She taught him things about soil management from her Nebraska farming background that changed the way he thought about the section of his south pasture that had always given him trouble. They argued about Thoreau. She was right and told him so, and he laughed, which was something she had discovered she loved, the surprise of his laughter, which was rarer than his smiles and more genuine than anything. In February, a man named Chester Dale, who ran a small herd just east of the Dunmore property and who had been quietly watching Alara's operation through the fall, came to her with a proposition that he presented as neighborly, but that on inspection was the kind of proposition that assumes the person being propositioned is more vulnerable than they are. He wanted to buy the grazing rights to her east section for a price that was approximately 60% of what those rights were worth. She declined. He became unpleasant about it. He told her, in the way of men who are unpleasant about being declined, that a woman running 160 acres alone was going to find things increasingly difficult, and that her pride was going to cost her. She told him clearly and without rancor that she was not selling grazing rights at any price to anyone, that she intended to stock the east section herself in the spring, and that, if he had further business concerns, she was happy to discuss them at a time, and in a manner that was mutually respectful. He did not have further concerns. He left. She told Garrett about this on his next visit, and he listened with the particular still attention he gave to things that mattered. When she finished, he said, "Do you want me to speak to him?" "No," she said immediately. "I handled it." "I know you handled it," he said. "I asked if you wanted me to." She looked at him. "No," she said more softly, "but thank you for asking." "Always," he said, and it was so simple and so complete that she had to look away for a moment. Spring came the way it comes in the high plains, in a slow negotiation between winter and warmth, the snow pulling back from the ridges by degrees, and the grass coming up in the creek bottoms first, and then spreading outward across the flats in a green that was almost painful after months of brown and white. Alara's cattle came through the winter better than she had hoped, helped by the shelter arrangements she and Garrett had worked out in November. And in April she added 12 head through a careful purchase from the Abilene broker he had recommended, bringing her herd to 20 head. It was on an April evening, with the windows open to the first genuinely warm air and the smell of new grass coming in from the pasture, that he came for supper and brought with him a small square box of dark wood that he set on her table with a care that told her immediately what it was. "I know I said I would court you properly," he said, "and I have tried to do that, but I have been thinking for some months now that properly in this case means being honest about what I want and what I hope, and what I want is a life with you, and what I hope is that you want that too." She looked at the box. "I am not a man who is easy to live with," he said, which was honest in the specific way she loved. "I am stubborn, and I hold my own counsel longer than I should, and I am sometimes so focused on the work that I forget the larger life that the work is supposed to be in service of. You have already told me I am too sure of being right about Thoreau, which may extend to other subjects." "It may," she agreed. "But I am also a man who will tell you the truth at whatever cost, and who will stand beside you, and who will never make you feel that being yourself is a problem to be corrected," he said. "And I love you. I have loved you since somewhere around October, when I realized I was counting the days until I saw you next, and counting them differently than I count anything else." She reached out and opened the box herself. The ring inside was simple and honest, gold with a small oval setting, nothing excessive, and it was exactly right. She looked at it, and then she looked at him and said, "Yes, Garrett." "Yes," and her voice when she said it was entirely steady and entirely real, and what was in it was more than adequate reply to everything he had said. He put the ring on her finger, and she stood up, and he stood up, and they were very close, and he put his hands on either side of her face with a gentleness that was different in quality from his usual composure, a gentleness that was not controlled but true. And when he kissed her, it was the kiss of two people who have been certain for a long time and are simply finally arriving. Mrs. Calloway cried when Garrett told her, which she would have denied vigorously if anyone had mentioned it directly. She said, with enormous practical dignity, that she would need at least 6 months' notice to plan a proper household arrangement. And Garrett said 4 months, and she said 5, and they settled on 4.5. They were married in June of 1885 in the Colton Creek Chapel, on a Saturday when the meadow grass outside was at full height, and the sky was the deep, particular blue of a dry summer morning. There were perhaps 60 people in attendance, which was most of the adult population of the immediate community. Thomas Arce from the bank was there, looking genuinely pleased. Simon Hale was there, with his shorthand notebook which he did not open. Frederick Morin from the council was there. Douglas Pratt was not. Alara wore a dress she had made herself over the winter, a good cream-colored wool that was practical and beautiful in equal measure, and she wore her dark hair pinned up with 2 small pearl combs that had been her aunt's. And she stood at the front of the chapel and looked at Garrett coming toward her with the focused, quiet expression of a woman who is paying complete attention to a thing that is completely worth attention. He stood beside her and looked at her, and said his vows in the even voice that she had come to love, because it was always real, nothing to it that was performance. And when the minister said the words that made them husband and wife, he held her hand with both of his and squeezed once, which was small and was everything. The celebration afterward was at his property, which was now their property, which Alara was already in her mind reorganizing in practical ways. The south pasture and the questions of rotation, the house arrangement that would need to accommodate her books and his cattle records, and the space where 2 independent and slightly stubborn people could be together without losing themselves, which she had thought about carefully and had solutions for. That evening, when the guests had gone and the stars were out over the ridge, and the cattle were quiet and Mrs. Calloway had gone to bed, they sat on the porch together in the warm June dark, and she leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the comfortable silence of 2 people who have talked enough for one day and find each other's quiet entirely sufficient. "Are you happy?" he asked. "I am," she said simply. "So am I," he said. They sat there for a while, and the stars moved overhead, and the night was warm, and everything was right. The summer of 1885 was a good summer for cattle on the Colton Creek Range. The rains came at reasonable intervals, and the grass held, and the market prices in the fall were favorable. Garrett and Alara ran the combined operation with the collaborative precision of 2 people who understood both cattle and each other. And they did not always agree, and they did not always have an easy time of it, because 2 self-sufficient and opinionated people sharing a working life do not always agree and do not always have an easy time. And this was true of them, and they were both honest enough to know it was exactly as it should be. She was right about the south pasture rotation, and the results the following spring proved it. He was right about the Hereford cross lines, and her herd in its 2nd year reflected it. They argued about the Colton Creek water rights debate with the same intellectual engagement with which they argued about Thoreau. And they were sometimes on the same side and sometimes not, and were always interested in the other's reasoning. In the autumn of 1885, Alara began to suspect, and then to confirm that she was pregnant, which she told Garrett on an October morning in the kitchen over breakfast with the same directness with which she told him everything. He went very still for a moment, and she watched something move across his face that she did not have a word for but recognized as the most unguarded expression she had ever seen on him. "Are you all right?" she asked, because she wanted to be sure. He stood up from the table and came around to where she was sitting, and he took her hands and looked at her with an openness that was different from his usual steadiness, something fuller and more vulnerable and more entirely honest. "I am more than all right," he said. "I am absolutely terrified, and I have never been happier in my life." She laughed, which was the laugh that was entirely her, surprised and genuine and warm, and he held her hands and smiled at her, and it was one of the best moments of both their lives. Their son was born in the spring of 1886, in May, when the meadow outside was in its first green again. He was named James William Olin, James for Garrett's father who had died in the war when Garrett was 12, and William for Alara's uncle who had been kind to her when kindness was what was needed. He came into the world with a certain opinionated determination that Mrs. Calloway said was entirely predictable given his parents, a statement she made with the deep satisfaction of someone whose predictions have been confirmed. He was a large and solid and loud baby who became a large and solid and interested child, interested in everything, in the cattle and the horses, and the books on his mother's shelf that he could not yet read but handled with reverent curiosity, in the way his father read the land, and the way his mother thought about problems, in the quality of things that were real and useful and well made. Alara's operation, which she had maintained as a linked but distinct concern through a legal arrangement she had worked out with Thomas Arce, grew steadily through the late 1880s. She had 40 head by 1887, and a hired hand, and a relationship with the Abilene broker that was firmly established on mutual respect. She had also become known, with the slow accumulation of time and visible competence, as a serious and reliable operator, and the initial skepticism of the community had converted, in the way that communities sometimes convert when confronted with enough plain evidence, into something closer to regard. Douglas Pratt left Colton Creek in 1887 to pursue a business venture in Colorado that was rumored to be connected with a mining concern. He was not missed in any particular way. Roy Sutter's operation limped along south of the county, and he was eventually bought out in 1889 by a larger concern from Texas, after which he moved on and was not heard of further. Simon Hale, the telegraph operator with the ambitions, did eventually move on to journalism, taking a position with a Denver paper in 1888. Before he left, he shook Garrett's hand and said, "That night in the council room was the best thing I ever covered." And Garrett said that he hoped the standard improved in Denver, and Simon laughed and said he suspected it would not. The Colton Creek community did what communities do. It changed slowly. People came and went. The town acquired a new general store and a proper physician in 1887 and a second church in 1889. The council debated things and resolved them and debated others. Thomas Arce retired from the bank in 1888, and his replacement was younger and somewhat less personally engaged in the affairs of his clients, which was probably appropriate. Frederick Morin served on the council for 6 years, and was then replaced by a cattle rancher from the northern range named George Alcott, who had strong opinions about the railroad's coming route through the county, and spent most of his tenure on that subject. And Garrett and Alara moved through those years with the specific quality of two people who have found the thing they were looking for and know how to keep it. They argued and worked and laughed and were sometimes difficult for each other and were always honest and were always, underneath everything, each other's. In the summer of 1888, Alara found herself expecting again, and this time she told Garrett in the evening by the stove rather than at breakfast, and he received it with a steadiness that was different from the terror of the first time, a steadiness that was simply joy, full and quiet and unhesitating. Their daughter was born in February of 1889, which was a cold February even by Colton Creek standards, with the wind coming down off the ridge for 3 days straight. She was named Clara Elizabeth Olin. Clara because Alara had always liked the name, and Elizabeth because it was close enough to her own name to feel like a continuity. She had her father's patient steadiness and her mother's concentrated gray-green eyes, and from her very first days, she looked at the world with an assessment that made Mrs. Calloway say, with the tone of someone depositing a fact in the record, "This one is going to be something." James was 2 years old when his sister arrived, and received her with the solemn gravity of a small person confronting something significant, examining her with the careful, focused attention that was already recognizably his mother's approach to things, and then announcing his considered opinion that she was small but would probably improve, which was judged to be an adequate welcome. By 1890, the Olin operation was among the most substantial in Colton Creek County. The combined property ran close to 2,000 head and employed 6 permanent hands and additional seasonal labor, and the accounting for it was done with the precision and intelligence that Alara brought to everything she managed, and the operational judgment was shared between them in the complementary way that two people with different but compatible forms of understanding can share things, each making the other more effective. They had not lost anything essential of themselves in the sharing. She was still independent in the specific way that she had always been independent, which is to say, she held her own views and spoke them, and carried her own weight, and expected to be regarded as a full person. He was still stubborn and held his counsel, and was sometimes more certain than was strictly warranted, and she told him so when it was so, and he took it and said so when she was right. One evening in the autumn of 1890, they sat together in the parlor after the children were in bed and the work was done for the day. The lamp was burning and she was reading, and he was reviewing the season's figures, and after a while he set the figures down and looked at her across the room. She looked up, sensing the shift. "What is it?" "Nothing," he said. "I was just looking at you." She looked at him with the expression that was still, after 6 years, capable of startling him because it was entirely direct and entirely warm and entirely herself. "Satisfied with your assessment?" She said. "Every time," he said. She closed her book and set it on the side table and looked at him with a directness that was not challenge but invitation. "I was thinking today," she said, "about September 1884. The broken axle," he said. "The broken axle," she confirmed. And the man who rode up and asked if he could help with a question that was entirely genuine, with no assumption that the answer would be yes. "It was a fair question to ask," he said. "Very few people ask it that way," she said, "without the assumption." He was quiet for a moment. "I think about it too," he said. "I think about you kneeling in the road with that axle housing in your hand, looking at it like the problem was already half solved." "It was," she said. "I just needed someone to help move the wagon." "You needed someone to believe you could solve it," he said, and it was not correction but completion. She looked at him across the quiet room with the lamp between them. "Yes," she said softly, "that is what I needed." Outside, the October wind was moving across the range in the dark, the same wind that had been moving across that range since before either of them was born, and would be moving across it long after. And the cattle were quiet in the pasture, and the house was warm, and the children were sleeping, and the years stretched ahead of them with everything they had built in them and everything still to come. He crossed the room and sat beside her and took her hand, the same way he had taken it on the ridge in November 3 years before. And she turned toward him, and what was between them was everything it had ever been and considerably more besides, deepened by years and work and honesty, and the specific daily intimacy of two people who have chosen each other repeatedly, not once but every morning, which is the only kind of love that holds. "I am glad you broke your axle," he said. She laughed, entirely surprised, and it was the laugh he loved more than anything, and she put her head on his shoulder and said, "So am I, Garrett, so am I." The lamp burned and the wind moved outside and the stars came out over Antler Ridge, and inside the Olin house on the Colton Creek Range in the autumn of 1890. Two people who had found each other the hard way and kept each other the honest way sat together in the warm and the quiet and the life they had built together from nothing but the willingness to look at things clearly and call them what they were. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. In the years that followed, James Olin grew into a boy who combined his mother's analytical clarity with his father's patience and his father's directness with his mother's precision, and who by the age of 7 had strong opinions about cattle breeding that were startling in their accuracy, and even more startling in the confidence with which he delivered them to the hired hands, who received them with the wary respect of men who knew the boy's parents. Clara grew into a girl who had decided very early that the most interesting things in any situation were the things that were not immediately obvious, and who spent her days on the range with an observational intensity that made even the most experienced of the Olin hands occasionally feel they were being studied to a conclusion. She had her mother's eyes and her father's jaw, and the particular quality of attention that was, in Colton Creek, beginning to be called simply the Olin look. Alara continued to run her portion of the operation with the same methodical intelligence she had brought to everything, and she added to it over the years a reputation in the county for practical agricultural knowledge that transcended the original skepticism entirely. By 1892, she was being consulted by other ranchers on questions of herd management and feed rotation, and the specific challenges of the Colton Creek soil, which she found simultaneously satisfying and mildly ironic given the history of her arrival. She said this to Garrett one evening with a wry precision that made him laugh and say that the county had eventually arrived at the correct assessment through the usual inefficient means, which was accumulating enough evidence to overcome its own assumptions. "Very generous of them," she said dryly. "It is the best most institutions can manage," he said, "including the Colton Creek Cattlemen's Council," she said. He considered. "Including them," he said, "though I remain unrepentant about my resignation." "As you should be," she said. "It was the right thing." "It always is when it's for the right reasons," he said. She looked at him across the supper table with the look he knew better than any landscape, the one that was entirely her and entirely for him. "And what were the right reasons exactly?" she asked, and her voice had the warmth in it that was underneath everything, underneath the precision and the competence and the directness, the warmth that was private and particular and his. "You," he said simply. "You were the reason." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and outside, the evening was coming down over the range in long gold light, and the children were somewhere on the property learning the particular lessons that a working land teaches children, and the cattle were moving to the water in the slow, purposeful way of cattle at evening, and the ridge to the north was turning the color of old copper in the last of the sun. He turned his hand over and held hers, and she held his back, and the evening light moved across the windows and the house was warm, and the story of them was not a story with an ending because it was still going, adding new days to itself in the steady accumulating way of all things that are truly alive. But if there was a place to look at it and say, yes, here, this is what it is and what it amounts to, it was here, in this kitchen, in this light, with these two people holding on. The years had been good. The hard ones had been worth it. The next ones stretched ahead with the same generous indifference that the land had always offered. All that space and sky and the possibility of everything. And they faced it together, which was the only way either of them had ever wanted to face anything that mattered.